Christian parenting.
Welcome to the Christian Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Steph Thurling. I'm the Executive Director of Christian Parenting, a mom of 3, and I am so glad that you're here. This is a place where you can bring your real self, no matter what that looks like today, and be given the space, resources, and encouragement you need to set aside perfection and grow into the perfectly imperfect parent God made you to be. Hello, friends, and welcome. Today, I am joined by Joon Park, also known as JS Park. And Joon is a hospital chaplain and shares a lot of his personal experiences on his Instagram page. And he recently published the book, As Long as You Need. And today, we are talking about loss and grief. And this is a little bit longer of an episode than I usually do because we were just having a really great, meaningful conversation. So I really encourage you to listen all the way through, but take it slow. We also started sharing timestamps in the show notes, so you can look through those and, skip around to the parts that you feel best suit your needs in this season, especially if you are in a season of grieving. So today, Joon and I cover how to be open and authentic about grief and loss with your kids using age-appropriate language and analogies, how to provide a safe and supportive environment for kids to grieve, how to walk your own grief journey while being emotionally available for your kids and upholding boundaries at the same time, and the importance of benefits of rituals to remember loved ones and experience a feeling of closure while honoring the loved ones and the process of grief. Joon reminds us that grief is messy and there is no way to manage it perfectly as a parent, but we have a God who is good and faithful and will be with us through it all. Hello, and welcome to the Christian Parenting Podcast.
Steph, I am very happy and honored to be here with you today.
I told you before we started recording, I think I'm really excited about this conversation, but it feels weird to say I'm excited about it because we are talking about grief and loss and how to navigate all of that with kids. So it's going to be kind of a heavier conversation, but I think also a uplifting conversation because it's going to be filled with hope too.
Yeah.
And there's definitely a marriage of those two things, right?
For sure. I think what I've noticed is socially, globally, people are more and more willing to talk about these things that are very difficult to talk about. I've been asked before, how do you feel about people going to your platform and the way that it's growing? And I think it means that people want to be honest and people are getting ready for this conversation. And so you're right that it may be weird to say, oh, I'm excited to talk about loss and grief and death and dying, but I think people are definitely ready for it and feeling that kind of hunger for honest conversation.
Yeah, about all sorts of things in life.
Yeah.
Not just this, right? I think people are looking for authenticity
Absolutely.
Right now, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so for people who do not know who you are and do not follow along with you on Instagram, and they should, tell us about you, tell us about your family, and then can you describe your family in one word or phrase?
Yeah. My pen name is JS Park. I go by Joon. So my family, friends, colleagues, and Steph, you may call me Joon. I am a hospital chaplain, have been for almost 9 years now. I've been married for almost 10 years, and my wife is a nurse practitioner. I have 2 kids. My daughter is almost 4, so she's 3 years, 9 months, and I have a 10-week-old.
So fun.
So this year had book baby and a baby, and
so you're not tired at all.
Oh no,
so much energy.
Oh yeah, they give me so much vitality, and I got coffee with me right now. No, you know what? It's one of those things. I think I was watching this episode of Bluey the other day. Sometimes I watch it with my kids, where they, the dad says something like, "Yeah, you make me feel young and old." Bluey goes, "How is that possible?" And he goes, "I don't know, but you find a way." It's true.
So good.
Yeah. I feel both pumped up and exhausted. It's all of those things, Parenting is a lot of lasagna, so many layers.
Yes.
And we do have an adopted dog. He just turned 14. He is so good with my daughter and son. And so we're technically a family of 5, including our good boy, Roscoe.
And what's your word or phrase that you would use?
I would say the word to describe our family would be exuberant.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That's a good word.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I mean, we are just we're constantly laughing all the time. And in the middle of dinner, we just take dance breaks and we act out stuff. And, my daughter at school, she listens so well and is very orderly and organized.
Mm.
And I tell her all the time at home, you can act however you want, get out your energy, you be you. And so she just loves to dance and get up and spin around, and she'll put on a whole play. And each night she puts on a show and she'll pretend something is a microphone. So we just have a house that loves to laugh. And I feel like for the work that both my wife and I do, because my wife in her work, she does wound care. And,
Mm.
I work with loss and grief and death and dying and, the ill and the injured. We lean into the joy completely. We give ourselves to it. There's no holding back. And,
Mm.
those moments, they come and they go. And I don't ever want to miss a single opportunity to laugh.
That's really beautiful. And such a great, it's a great word with a great explanation behind it.
Yeah.
And that's why I love asking this question. It's a good one.
Yeah, it's a great
you
question.
You learn a lot.
Very, very good question. Yeah.
Okay, so the other one that I also always ask and that I prepped you for is, what is one thing you want every parent to know?
Thinking about this, I'm sure maybe one of the common answers is don't have to be perfect. Sometimes the dishes can be done the next day, that sort of thing. Mistakes are going to happen. I would say for me, I was afraid to have kids, and for a time I didn't want to. And my wife was, of course, very sad to hear that. And she understood, because when I grew up, the household that I was in was very turbulent, very unpredictable, very inconsistent and abusive. And so I was afraid that somehow I had inherited something like sickness and I was going to pass it on to my kids. And I didn't want that. But I would say what I would want every parent to know is that it is possible for cycles to be broken. It's possible. I don't want to hold myself up as proof of that, but I am learning, unlearning, relearning so many things, and I've found so much healing. And I'm very lucky and grateful that I have resources, safe community, people, my wife, people that I can trust and who have poured out for me, and that I can share these hard things with that I've gone through. And, thankful for therapy as well. And I just have been able to break the cycles that I never thought I could escape. Not only that, but write a new story, So no one enters a family with a blank canvas. No one enters without baggage. But I believe it is possible with safe community resources to write something new, to have a different pen, a different take. So for any family listening, I believe 100,000%. I mean, absolutely believe we can break the cycle and make something new.
Yeah. And it's never too late to start. Like, you can start now.
Yeah, never too late. I just got into consistent therapy now about 4 years ago. And before that, I was in therapy, but very inconsistently. And I was finding new people all the time. But never ever too late to start. I know it's so much investment and effort. But I think everyone pays kind of like, I don't want to say cost because that's a very strong word, but we do invest and like expend our time, exert our effort in certain directions. And one of those is going to be, the having a family or working our job, those kinds of, daily life things. But we also pay an unnecessary cost if we don't spend the effort in digging deep in ourselves. Because then it comes back like, the lack of effort, or the sort of, I don't want to say lack of effort. That's not the right phrase either. I would say if we don't invest now, it ends up we sort of end up paying for it later, if that even makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. You're giving your kids a gift when you invest in yourself in that way.
Yeah. So I definitely don't want to pay that extra tax, And so I'm going to spend that effort now while I can, when I can. And it is never too late to start that, because, what we do today, it will dictate tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I want to hear a little bit more of your story. Like, how did you become, coming from your family of origin and then where you are now? How did you decide to become a hospital chaplain? And what does that involve even?
Yeah. Well, Steph, I'll make a short story long. No, I mean, you know, I'm a child of immigrants, and that comes with, things you would expect, and then things that um, are, yeah, it comes with its own type of difficulties. And there's also gifts that it comes with as well. And so I mentioned earlier that I grew up in a very turbulent household. My parents fought constantly. There was a lot of violence in the house between my mom and dad and my brother and myself. And at the same time, my parents being Korean, there's so much beauty in their heritage and their stories. And I know that they tried their best. I mean, even moving here to America, raising kids here in America, that's a whole um, wild amount of effort that I can't even wrap my head around and my heart around. I can't imagine just uprooting and moving to, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then them preserving their culture, their heritage, all of that for me, and passing down so much legacy. But yeah, I grew up with so much trauma and quite a bit of abuse. And there were years and years I didn't talk to my parents. I've since reconciled with both of them. But I think what I always needed, that I knew I needed when I was younger, was a consistent and steady presence. Someone to tell me that regardless of everything that's happening, you're still loved. You know, even when things don't seem that way around you, you still have value. Your situation doesn't say anything about you, because trauma has a way of imprinting upon us this idea that because this happened, I'm somehow stained, or I'm not good, or my identity and value are permanently bruised. Yeah, abuse doesn't just mark our bodies; it marks our hearts and our souls. And so I carried that with me, and in many ways, I'm still healing from it. But I grew up an atheist, and I came to faith quite late in life. You know, and it wasn't one any academic argument. It wasn't one any apologetic, anything like that. It was just the love of this tiny church. They asked me to play drums. This was around college. And I said, yeah, I asked, is there a problem that I'm an atheist? They said, no, just come on and play drums for us. And yeah, they sort of side tackled me with love, just this supernatural grace. And I just went backwards to the source, and I said, there's something to this. And that's how I came to faith, and then found myself in ministry. And then in ministry was always a little bit of an oddball. I think that it takes a very special type of person to be a pastor. And I tried for 7 years. I love the students that I served, youth and college. And then eventually, after doing this like prison ministry for a couple of weeks, I heard the term chaplain for the first time, and then found my way into chaplaincy at a teaching hospital, did the internship and the year-long residency. And I knew that's where I belonged. And one of the ways that I knew that I belonged there was because on the hardest day of these patients' lives, my patients' lives, in crisis, when the irreversible happens, what is it that we need then? Not advice, not lecture or lesson, but a presence alongside. And what I knew I needed back then, I get to be now. And that in itself is a type of healing. And so I'm so glad and grateful to be in the work that I'm in.
Yeah, that's a great story and such important work. I worked at churches with youth ministry for a very long time, and I loved it too, but it does take a certain type of person to do that job.
Yeah, if I only had to worry about the congregation and the students, I probably could have kept doing it. But I wasn't smart enough for the church politics and the backroom boardroom stuff. And maybe I wasn't savvy enough. I didn't know how to raise funds. I didn't know how to, navigate leaders. And so, there's a Korean word, tunjinhae, which means like naive/gullible. I just believe everything everybody said. But sometimes when a pastor says something or a leader says something, it's not always what they mean. It turns out, and I just take everything at face value. I don't believe people naturally lie, but not everybody, acts in good faith, right? And so
Yeah.
I think maybe I wasn't just built for that. And it does take a special type of, and I'm not saying every church is like that. I was in a more toxic place. But when I got to the hospital, healthcare certainly isn't perfect. But the chaplain
Mm.
department, I really felt strongly and feel strongly that, especially in the hospital, we're all on the same page with the same mission. There's a type of urgency where, the kind of bickering and backroom politics that I saw, at least in the church that I was at, there's hardly any space for that in the hospital. And I've often
Yeah.
thought, what if the church was run that way, with that type of urgency and mission and that sort of compassion and the very clear view of what our mission is? And so that's
Mm.
where I found the hospital is the place that I know I want to be and need to be.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. So we're going to talk a little about grief today and loss, since that is what you do all the time. It
Yeah.
takes a special person to do that, and that is you. So we're going to break it down a little bit. And I want to kind of focus on two things. I want to talk about helping our kids walk through grief, but I also want to talk about how you parent through grief. How do you consistently show up for your kids while you're grieving on your own? So let's start with the kids.
Mm-hmm.
No one wants their kids to experience loss and grief, like especially young kids. We just don't want our kids to. But we live in a broken world and we can't protect them from everything. So if our kids are grieving, how do we recognize and support the ways that they're grieving, considering just where they're at developmentally and their understanding of loss, knowing that they're kids, not adults? Like, how do we support our kids best?
Yeah, I can give you both a big picture, what I've seen in the hospital, and also my own personal experience, since my wife and we suffered a miscarriage last Easter.
Mm.
And at the time, our 2-year-old, who has deep emotional intelligence and a really great understanding of the world around her, we had to sit her down and talk with her about it. And then I also
Mm-hmm.
lost a childhood friend last summer. And my daughter very early on learned about death and loss. And so that was something personal in our home that I experienced. But in the hospital, the big picture, what I can say is, when talking about grief, when talking about loss with anyone, the way that we would talk about it with a 95-year-old or a 55-year-old, uh, it needs to work for every age. So what works for a 5-year-old ought to work for an 85-year-old as well. You know,
Hmm.
to overcomplicate it, if it's not going to help a child, it certainly won't help an adult, and vice versa. And so, even in talking with children about loss, I learned so much about how we talk about it and the sensitivity and care that we need. And with children, I can give you a couple examples. When we have a patient who is a child, or we have a patient who has children, and we're trying to break news about something hard that's about to happen or has happened, we involve several people. Like, we have a child psychologist and a child life specialist. So I've seen this in real time. I've seen this play out. And there is a care and a cushioning and a sensitivity about building up to some of the harder things. And I've seen a lot of analogies being used for children. And for children, it does help to scale it down as much as you can. And scaling it down, I don't mean to say like dumbing it down, because that's a completely different thing. But I remember very vividly, and I'm changing some details just to protect their privacy, but one child where we had to break some really hard news about a loss in their family. And so the child psychologist actually first met with the family and sort of coached them a little bit. Like, here's a way to explain the loss in a way that will very gently get them there. And we're guiding them, and they're trusting you, right? And that's the thing with children, is that they're trusting everything that you say. And the way that we cushion them in that moment is how they will be carried through their grief journey. So that beginning kind of crisis moment, it's so important how we cushion and offer care. And I remember that the example that they used was, went to this child. I think he was older than 5, I think younger than 10. And they said, hey, do you remember that movie Finding Nemo, uh, where the mom in the beginning, she doesn't make it and she's gone, and the dad ends up raising Nemo, and the child, of course, remembered that. It was a very vivid movie. They said, yeah, so do you remember what happened with the mom? And they went back and forth about the mom got hurt, and the mom got hurt in such a way that she was gone and couldn't come back. And so they said, well, this so and so, your family member, they also got hurt in the same way. And very sadly, they're going to be gone too. And then the questions come, where are they now? Are they in heaven? Am I going to get hurt? Are you going to get hurt? And so I think that analogy, bringing it down that way, and then being prepared for those questions. The main thing is not necessarily the very content of what we're doing. It could have been any movie, but how we offer that and how we build up to it and being available. And what I noticed in that room was the child psychologist, the family, child life specialist, they stayed with this child for a very long time. Because to just deliver that news and go, that's not going to be helpful. That's what they'll remember. They may not remember the content, but they'll remember how they were carried. And that's so important, is the way that we carry them. It's incredibly important to be available and present, to answer all those questions and to use those kind of very careful, compassionate analogies. With my daughter, as soon as we told the news to her, we said, that we told you about, you're going to be a big sister. And we said, that's not going to happen anymore. We're really sorry. She was quiet for about an hour, which is very uncharacteristic of her. She's only a chatterbox. She narrates everything, as some children do.
Yeah, I have one of those.
Yeah. It's just a verbal processor, question after question. And we encourage that. But she was quiet for about an hour. So we were there with her, and, she kind of did her own thing a little bit, and we just sat with her. And after about an hour, she just looked at me and she asked, how come baby's gone? And then she kept asking, how come baby's gone? How come? She understood baby being gone. She didn't know how come. And I kept trying to answer in different ways. But in the end, I don't know if she was looking for an answer, because she just kept asking the same question, and it almost became a reflex. But I think she wanted to know the fact that I was there and I would always answer her and that I was available. And I remember there was a moment when she just stopped asking and she just held me and just wanted to be held. And so I can say to any parent, to any family where they're experiencing loss, first, it is really important to get those resources involved. If there's a specialist, if there's a therapist, things like that, a trained pastor, those kinds of things, incredibly important to kind of get the in-between advice about how do we inform, how do we break this down, and then to attune ourselves to our children to what would work for them. What do they find in their language, their symbols, their story that will work for them. But more important than the content of that conversation is the way that they are carried, the way that they are held. That's so incredibly important, that they feel safe. And that sounds so obvious, but even as you and I are talking right now, if I start talking to you and then I just start checking my phone or my watch, or even if I just glance away for a second like this and I break eye contact, there's something about that where you suddenly feel disconnection. And kids are so smart. They can feel that disconnection, even if it's for a minute. They can kind of feel the loss of presence. And so it's important that when they experience loss, that sudden vacuum, that void that they feel, the emptiness, that the person who is breaking this news to them remains and remains available. And so more than contents, how we're carried.
Yeah. If you're in a similar stage of life as I am, you probably are talking a lot about hormones with your friends, whether you're having babies or done having babies and notice that everything is just a little bit different. There's a lot going on with our bodies as women. Happy Mammoth, the company that created Hormone Harmony, is dedicated to making women's lives easier. And that means making products using only science-backed ingredients that have been proven to work for women. They make no compromise when it comes to quality, and it shows. Their product, Hormone Harmony, helps women maintain optimal hormone levels and supports hormones within a normal range. So if you ever experience occasional symptoms like hot flashes and night sweats, racing thoughts and low moods, poor sleep and feeling tired all the time, Hormone Harmony can help with all those things and more. And the biggest benefit? Feeling like yourself again. That's what women mention over and over in their reviews. And there are over 17,000 reviews for Hormone Harmony. For a limited time, you can get 15% off your entire first order at happymammoth.com. Just use the coupon code CPPodcast at checkout. That's happymammoth.com and use the code CPPodcast for 15% off today. I want to go back a little bit to like the questions that the kids ask. I have been thinking about this because it was actually during a time of grief and loss that I met Jesus. I was 10 years old. One of my friends tragically died in a plane crash. And it was really the catalyst to me finding my faith because I had a lot of questions. And what I found was that when someone explained Jesus to me, that was the answer to a lot of the questions that I had, the hope that I needed. And I think that grief opens the door to a lot of reflection, a lot of questions, even for our youngest kids. And that can be, I think, scary for parents because, while sometimes those questions lead to you finding Jesus, maybe it leads to being mad or turning away or all of the things that, would be a normal response to a tragedy. So how do you suggest that Christian parents approach the topic of God and faith with their kids during this time of grieving when they're asking all the questions and want to know why?
Yeah, that's great, Steph. First, I just want to lift up and honor the loss that you had when you were 10. I'm so sorry to hear about that. And what an amazing gift that is that you're able to find hope and find faith in that time, and just how that carried you and brought you all the way here. I'll try to answer by saying this way. I think there's a healthy way to talk about faith and afterlife and loss and heaven and theology with children. And there's also, I want to caution a pitfall. I think first I can talk about the pitfall in that even with people who are adults, my patients who are adults, if I lean into faith too hard or start talking about theology, sometimes my patient who's experiencing such severe loss and crisis, they can be so emotionally vulnerable that in some ways I'm offering something that can become manipulative, not even intentionally. I may think that I'm offering something that's helpful, but at that point they're reaching for anything. And if they're going to believe something just because they're that emotionally open and vulnerable, I've, I think, done a disservice to my patient then, because I'm offering something in a state where they are open for anything. And it's almost like I may be deceiving them, even if it's something good, even if it's something helpful. I never want to even unintentionally manipulate or exploit where my patient is, So I'm going to enter very gently and try to make sure that I'm not offering something that they're just grabbing because they need anything, At the same time, we do need something. We do need anything when the ground just opens up and loss happens,
Yeah.
As we circle mortality and the edge of that abyss, we do need something. And so when kids have those questions, for me, and this may not work for everyone, and I don't want to write a prescription, but for me, what I try to do is I do try to explain my own experience with faith. It's incredibly important for me that I frame it as, here's what I believe. Here is my story about faith. Here's what gives me hope. And it's almost like I'm offering this gift, and I'm giving the option of, you can open this gift in your own time, And so here's where my faith has led me in my experience of loss and what it has given me and the hope that it has given me. And so, for example, my own daughter, she had questions about heaven and afterlife and being curious. And, she wanted to know, where did she go? I was supposed to be a big sister. And so I tried to frame it as, what I understand or what I believe God says here, or, what I believe that the story of Scripture says. Now, I know some Christian parents may balk at that and say, no, you got to present it as, information. You got to, and that's, I don't want to invalidate that. But I want to be very careful that we're not using that moment as a way to just insert information that they have to believe, but
Mm-hmm.
rather, here is this story of hope, and I hope that it helps, and it's a very fine line, and it's not perfect. It's going to be messy.
Yeah.
But I do want to teach faith. I do want to teach, my daughter about God and about Scripture in a way that is not pressuring, in a way that is not pushing, in a way that's not persuading her just into a cognitive assent, but rather
Yeah.
here's the hope of it, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, here's what we can lean on, and here's how I've leaned on it.
Yeah. Well, kids respond. I mean, everyone responds better to that, right? Like, there's a reason that there's power in stories and testimony. And it's because when you say, here's my life before Jesus, here's my life after Jesus, this is why I believe what I do because of what I've found. And this is a lot more, it's just a better way to present the gospel than just like start reading scripture. Like people are going to respond better to a story and to your real life experience than just a lecture.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great way to think about it. And sometimes we also end up saying things if we start going down the lecture route instead of the story route. We start saying things like, well, God has a plan for this, and this is part of God's purpose. And that's not what anyone wants to hear when you just experienced a loss. It's just not.
Yeah.
But it's an easy thing to say.
It is. I mean, those platitudes, they just roll right off the tongue, right?
They
and
do.
and I think there's some way that's a little bit of self-soothing. I've empathized
Yeah.
a lot with people who say those things because it's kind of like, I just need to speak into the silence, and here's this thing.
Yeah.
And in the end, those things end up being kind of thin and, just coats of sugar. And, the timing is off. And I don't want to, again, I don't want to invalidate anybody that helps. But at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, we do say those things sometimes as a way to like insulate ourselves from the discomfort of the moment and the loss.
Yeah.
But having that
Do you have any
conversation.
phrases that
Mhm.
you find to actually be helpful?
Yeah, well, again, to be careful to avoid prescription, but I
Yeah.
think just simple, empathic, compassionate statements are really the best that we can do. I'm so sorry to hear that. Or sometimes I mirror something if I try to name
Mm.
what that person is feeling. Like they may say a whole lot of angry things and just say, that makes me angry to hear too. Or I feel really sad when you told that story, and I feel your sadness. You know, so naming the things, just saying compassionate, empathic statements. Sometimes we don't have to say anything at all. I do think there is something cultural for my culture anyway, where silence is very treasured. Like, where yeah, there's something in my own Korean culture where usually the person who talks the least is considered the wisest just by default. Automatically, there goes the sage. And there's something cultural about people who want to fill the silence all the time. I think on the radio or in a podcast when there's, we call it dead air when there's silence. I mean, what a name that is, right? I think if I stop talking literally for 5 seconds right now, anybody listening would start squirming a little bit, me included.
Hmm.
But yeah, the things I found most helpful, I mean, statements are not always the best, but I think those kinds of compassionate, like feeling with, and then also when asking someone, how are you? Or how are you doing right now? The intention is always kind, but sometimes the impact is a little bit burdensome because that person
Mm.
feels like they have to respond and unpack how they're doing. And not everybody wants to answer that question. Questions like, hey, what can I do for you? Do you need anything right now? That can also be burdensome because the person's starting to feel like, oh, I have to respond to something and give this person a task to do. So sometimes when I see someone grieving and loss, I will try to give a very specific provision of help and say, hey, this Thursday, 6 o'clock p.m. for dinner time, I can order food for you. Or, hey, here's a gift card for some food delivery service or something that I know that you like, or for groceries. Or I can get you the groceries that you need for this weekend. I don't want you to
Mm.
worry about that. Let me wash your dishes, this Sunday night. Something like that, where I can do your laundry. And it won't be perfect, but I do want to fill in the gap for this area. Those specific offers of help are very important. And then in the middle of that, if they want to tell you how they're feeling, maybe they'll be that opportunity. But I found those things, compassionate, concrete help, you know, to be the most meaningful things that we can do. Anytime it starts to veer towards like making a grand theological statement, that's what I'm kind of like,
Yeah.
hey, we got to bring that in a little bit, bring that back. And again, I get why we do it. It almost feels like, oh, we're trying to help, but that's a fix it type impulse, and that's something that we need to kind of monitor in ourselves when we see somebody hurting.
Yeah. Yeah. It is a fix it impulse, but we all have that, especially if we're dealing with our kids, because we want them to feel better. Like,
Yeah.
how can we make them feel better, like as fast as possible? Because I don't want them to hurt anymore, you know?
Yeah, it hurts to see
So,
someone hurt. That's the impulse that
mm,
emerges. I used to be so mad in hospital rooms when a family member would just say those kinds of things. These days, I have a lot more empathy for it. I would say probably the last
yeah.
4 or 5 years. I just really get why we say those things. And so my goal is, when I see a patient, often I'm seeing, their whole family too. It's a lot to navigate, and different
Yeah.
ages, and they're all in different places in their grief. And so I'm trying to make as much room as I can for those who are fixers, for those who are feelers, for those who are numb, for those who are expressive. And how can I make room for that? And sometimes as a chaplain, I feel like it's impossible. But at the same time, it is possible to make and expand room, different feelings and different ages. I do believe it's possible.
Yeah. For families who are grieving together, how do you have any like practical advice or tips of things that they can do to kind of like cope and heal together, moving in their own pace, but just kind of unifying as a family and being like, we're here, we're all doing this together?
Yeah, I would say at least two things. One is it's a, I think it is wise and compassionate to move, to have the family move at the speed of the person who is hurting the most in that moment.
Mm.
Um, because I think what I hear so often is, I feel like I'm a burden on my family because they're all here and I'm back here. That's the thing I
Mm.
hear so commonly. And what they wish is they have two kind of an internal conflict. I want to be where my family is because I feel like I'm a burden on them, but I want them to be where I'm at because I'm hurting so much. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's a split between I'm hurting, but I also don't want to be a burden. And that's a difficult internal conflict. There's so much guilt and shame wrapped around it. But I would say, as a family, whenever possible, with the capacity we're given, because when there's loss that happens, it's always communal. The whole family feels it. The whole community feels it. The best that we can with the capacity we're given to try to meet the hurting person where they're at, and it's going to change. Each person will go through kind of their own stages. With grief, there are quote unquote good days and bad days.
Mm.
Grief, if it's if the picture that we have is it comes in waves, each person will get those waves differently. Some people will be high tide, some will be low tide. But I think we can all pause for that one person. And then I would also say, whenever we can, um, well, I can say two things. One, whenever we can, as a family, when joy interrupts the sadness, I would say that's not an interruption. Um,
Mm.
People who are sad, they're not just somber all the time. You know, they can still smile. Joy and sorrow can coexist. Sometimes I've seen like the comment section of like courtroom stuff where the defendant who was hurt or injured, when they leave the courtroom, they're laughing with their friends. And they're like, oh, I thought they were hurt. I thought they were injured. How can they laugh at a time like this? Or, oh, that person's depressed, but in their profile pictures, they're happy. All of
Mm.
those things can exist at the same time. And so when the joy comes, I think people feel like, oh, but I just experienced loss. I can't laugh right now. I've been in so many rooms where, or even around a deathbed, where the family will start reminiscing about the one they just lost. And then they'll just start laughing, like clapping their knees, clapping their hands at the top of their lungs, laughter. And through a window, they might, oh, that's so inappropriate. But that is in that moment what they need. They're remembering. And in that remembrance, there's both, it's fixed together, the joy and the sorrow, right?
Yeah.
So when families are grieving, when that joy comes, to let it happen, you know, and then when the times of remembrance come, to let that happen too. Because sometimes it's like, oh, if we remember them, we got to keep the past in the past. We're trying to move on. No, when their story pops up, pause for a moment to recollect and remember. And I would even recommend for families who have lost someone, maybe even setting aside some time, whether that's daily or
Mm.
weekly, to just remember them. In my own culture, we celebrate each year, not just birthdays, but also death days. And I know for some families that's not going to work. But for our family, we do it every year. We celebrate my dad-in-law's dad, who died some years ago. We get together every year, and sometimes family flies in for this, and we just tell stories. And I remember
Mm.
the last time we did this, I never met my dad-in-law's dad. I never met my, grandpa-in-law. Last time we did this, I asked my dad-in-law, I said, how did your dad laugh? I was curious to know. And then
Yeah.
he imitated the laugh. And then everyone in the room who had met him said, that's exactly how he sounds. And so those little things, not shying away from the person who's gone, but remembering them, I think can be a very helpful ritual and a time of coming together where closeness can be had by just remembering what is gone.
Yeah. I think those rituals are so important too. I'm just reflecting now. I lost a friend during COVID, and we didn't have a service for her. And her family chose not to for many reasons. But it was really weird. Like, I pulled my family together and just started telling my kids stories about her, because for me, it was like I needed that ritual of remembrance because it wasn't coming in the form of a funeral.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
I just think I love the idea of doing that every year.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah. I mean, even when you look at throughout the pages of scripture, there's so much memorializing. Like the book
Yeah.
of Numbers is literally just numbers and then names, and then people who have gone on. And it's just heritage and lineage. And there is so much lifting up and commemorating. And I think that is a deeply divine and sacred practice. And I think there's
Mm.
something where we shy away from that type of remembrance because we think talking about death somehow invites negativity into the room. But I would argue almost the opposite. I would say that talking about our losses is a way to honor and lift up life, and is a way to invite all the impact and influence and legacy and the gifting of that person. God gave us this person for a season, and we can honor and remember them and integrate them and incorporate them now into our lives. That passage in Acts, I think, where it talks about, David served his purpose, and then he went to sleep with his ancestors. We still talk about David, and,
Mm.
we commemorate and honor him. And in some way, the life of David, the life of all of those in scripture becomes a part of our faith. Talking about I guess is it the Hall of Fame in Hebrews 12, those faithful heroes, they're all a part of our legacy and who we are. And so I think there is something beautiful, as hard as it is, to sort of tell those stories like you did about your friend, to your children.
Hmm.
There's something beautifully healing about that, as hard as it is. And I think so many people hold themselves back from it, thinking that it'll attract something bad. But I would say the opposite. I think it's something that our body needs as a way to grieve.
Yeah. I want to move into that space a little bit of grieving as a parent. Because when my friend in COVID, when I lost her, she lived out of state. My kids did not know her. So they did not grieve her death, but they watched me grieve her death. And so that was a really different experience than like when I lost my grandparents, because they were involved in my kids' lives. There's like two different ways that they experienced grief in that. So for parents who are struggling in that, like they're experiencing grief and maybe their kids aren't in the same way. Like how would you encourage parents to still be emotionally available to their kids, but honor that grief? And I guess maybe even how did you manage that at your house when you and your wife lost your baby because you were grieving differently than your daughter? So how do you make that all happen?
Yeah. So there's for sure not going to be a perfect answer to this. It's so messy, and every parent, every person is different. All the ways that we grieve are different. Um, you may have seen this diagram. It's concentric circles. And there's this article talking about how we process our losses. And here's the
Mm,
person who is hurting on the inside, and in the very center of the circle. And on the outside, you have this person who is listening to this person hurting and listening to their stuff. Now, this person, they're hurting, they hear all this stuff, they pour out to someone outside the circle. But what doesn't work is if someone pours out to you and then you just pour back out to them because they're the one hurting on the inside. The venting has to go wider and wider in concentric circles, if that makes sense. And I'm not sure if I explained that 100% well, but that's basically to say when my kid is grieving and pours out to me, I want to be careful that I'm not just, then I just dump everything back onto my child. There is still
mm,
something in a parent's responsibility and leadership in that on one hand, we want to be completely vulnerable and authentic and open. We want to know when to ask for forgiveness. We want to be able to be emotionally available. We don't want to shy away from the harder things in our hearts. But there is still the responsibility part of I'm a parent and they're trusting me and I'm guiding them. And they're doing all of this for the first time. And there's a newness to all of it. And there's kind of the wet cement of our children, their hearts, you know? And yeah, I mean, that is the essential question. How do we navigate with them while we're navigating ourselves?
mm-hmm.
But what I try to keep in mind is I can't process everything that is in my heart with my child. That would be unfair for them. You know, that's a lot to
Yeah.
put on them. And so I think in terms of those concentric circles, like there are other people that I can pour out to. There are, my therapist or my wife or my community, other chaplains, here are my safe friends. And so I think there has to be some sort of direction in which, for the most part, we are keeping a very consistent continuum and direction. So for my child, when I was very sad, of course, with our miscarriage, and in many ways, I was taking care of my daughter, and then I had to go outside to find help for myself,
Mm-hmm.
and it had to be basically two lanes. And then, when my childhood friend died last summer, I watched his funeral online. I could not go. And I remember at some point in the funeral, there was this hymn that was sung. And my childhood friend and we had sung that hymn together in church. And I just started crying. I couldn't stop. I just burst into tears. And at the time, 3-year old, um, I think she had just turned 3. She hugged me and she looked up in my face and she said, "I'm sorry your friend is gone."
Mm,
You know? And wow, what a innocent and kind and compassionate gesture that she gave me. And I did not shy away from or hide my emotions at that moment. And part of me felt bad, like, oh, you're not supposed to be taking care of me, you know? But on the other hand, she fully gave of herself to me. And so that whole thing is a difficult and delicate dance about
yeah.
how much do we show our children, how open can we be with them. So I understand on one hand, I have this responsibility of guiding and leadership. On the other hand, in tandem with the responsibility is also authenticity. I want to be completely open to my child. And so it won't go perfectly, but I know that my parents, as hard as it was to grow up with them, they were pretty open about their emotions with me. They processed with me. And so I'm glad for that they were pretty emotionally
Mm.
open, maybe sometimes in a way that wasn't always healthy. But I think that's what we need, and keep and kind of juggling those and knowing what our lanes are at any given moment. You know, when do I serve, and when do I know I need to reach out?
Yeah. I feel like it's encouraging to listen to you speak, because what I keep coming back to, the theme that is just flowing throughout this, is that it's not going to be perfect. And so if your child is grieving, or you're grieving together, or you're the one grieving, or whatever it is, that type of loss that your family may experience, like, it's not going to look perfect, and it's not going to look the same for every family either. And I think there's some freedom in that, because I think sometimes we're like, okay, now as parents, we want a checklist. Like, so now what do I do? Like, okay, grandma's gone now. How, like, give me the checklist for what I do for this. And it's kind of freeing to know there isn't a checklist, and that's okay.
Yeah, that is okay. I mean, the last thing I would want is to try to feel like I, did something wrong by showing my child my emotions,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because some parents feel like, oh, I need to be composed all the time for my child, Um, but no, I think we can be emotionally vulnerable with them. And I think there are times, especially as our children age, that they will show us, they will teach us, they will instruct us. And, there's just kind of this very imperfect, messy, back and forth, push and pull dynamic that happens, And I try to keep in mind my responsibility, while at the same time, hey, we're all human. We're all trying to,
Yeah.
get through this together. And so at that moment that my child basically offered that compassion, there was a part of me that almost wanted to say, I'm sorry, like, you shouldn't be in this position, like, to say, to comfort me, to console me. At the same time, how pure and how incredible was that gesture from her,
Mm.
that she found the spirit and wherewithal and compassion to do that. So yeah, I hope no parent, no family feels like pressured to fit this perfect outline of what needs to happen, you know,
Mm-hmm.
to know their lanes, to know their roles, but also realize, hey, sometimes, the lanes aren't perfect, yeah, the lines can get here and there. And yeah, there's something very beautiful about a child um, feeling like my parents don't hide, you know, my
Mm-hmm.
parents don't just stuff it all down for my own sake. They're real with me. And that honesty in itself can cultivate more compassion.
Yeah. I just feel like that story could apply to so many different areas of parenting too, not just like grief, but just showing some vulnerability of like, look, dad's not perfect, and your child just showing compassion back.
Yeah. Have you ever watched This Is Us?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I haven't finished it, but
I didn't finish it either.
yeah, well,
My husband always said it has too. He said, and my husband's very in touch with his emotions, but he
yeah,
doesn't really handle it well in TV shows. He was like, "We have to stop watching it because there's always a feeling, but I don't know what the feeling's going to be, and it's too much for me."
yeah. That show is like every episode is for some reason a
Because you got a
tearjerker.
feeling.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And the way it,
Yeah.
like, dips back and forth throughout history, you feel like you're time traveling almost, and so
Yeah.
nostalgic. But there's one scene, my favorite scene in the show, and it's such a small little throwaway scene, is when Jack Pearson, the dad in the show, it's a flashback to when he's raising his kids. And I think it's his son, is it Kyle, or Kevin, is having a really hard
Kevin.
time at
Yeah.
the swimming pool. And he's probably like 6 or 7 at the time in that flashback. And his son is like really complaining and really upset and just like venting. And then the dad character, he gets down on his knee, I think, and he's like so frustrated because he wants his child to like kind of be okay. And he tells his son, he's like, "Hey, Kevin, this is the first time I'm doing this. Please, just this is the first time being a dad. I'm not doing it." He just starts being really
Mm-hmm.
honest. And the fact that he said, like, this is my first time doing this, like, almost like, please give me a break, And then you see the kid still be upset because, oh, okay, dad, okay. And I love that little moment of connection where it's almost like, you don't want to put that on your kid, but at the same time, it's like, come on, please know I'm human too,
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
love that scene, and it's stuck with me. And I think about it like once a month, just that really, really human moment where it's like, I'm still dad and I'm also still human.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like that show's filled with things that you think about once a month.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. Yes. Oh, well, thank you so much for joining me. This was all so good and so important to talk about. And so I really appreciate your wisdom and your experience and your willingness to share with us. Before you go, can you tell us how we can connect with you and then how we can get a copy of your book and all the things?
Yeah. I'm on all the social media. I'm under JS Park. And my book can be found at aslongasyouneedbook.com.
Okay, great. I'll put that all in show notes that it's easy for people to find. But
Perfect.
thank you again for being here. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Steph.
Thank you for joining me today. I just love how Joon's personal stories and experiences really highlighted that the journey of grief is just part of humanity, and we all walk through it at some point. I hope that if you're in a season of grief, you feel a little less alone and found something in this time that you can cling to provide comfort and encouragement and support. If you are grieving right now and would like prayer, please reach out to the Christian Parenting team and we would be honored to pray for you. You can email us at info@christianparenting.org. Thank you for joining us. May God bless you this week. May you find hope in the promises of God and remember that He is with you in every season of life. Through every high and every low, He is good and faithful. And while our world may change and our lives may be shaken, He is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening to the Christian Parenting Podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you love this podcast, would you please consider leaving a review and sharing it with a friend? This is the best way to reach more people and encourage even more parents. Christian Parenting is a donor-funded ministry, and we rely on friends like you to keep podcasts like this going. So to find out more about Christian Parenting and to make a donation, head over to christianparenting.org or at christianparenting_org on Instagram. Thank you again. See you next week.